Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the 45th AAAS Science and Technology Forum. I'm Sudip Parikh. I have the privilege of serving as the CEO of AAAS and the executive publisher of the Science family of journals. I think it's safe to say that this forum is unlike any that have preceded it in those 45 years. 2020 has shown us many things, good, bad, and ugly. One unexpected lesson for me has really been that paradigms, systems, institutions can change in an instant. And I wasn't expecting that. I've worked in policy my entire life, and what I always took away from it was a slow slog. And what I took away from this year is that if we want to reimburse telemedicine, we can do it. If we want to change the way that funding goes out the door, we can do it. And so that means that there's other lessons to be learned. This S&T forum is going to get beyond the usual abstract policy thinking, really to touch upon concrete policy choices and their implications. I want to thank the wonderful work of the AAAS staff and the Committee on Science, Engineering, and Public Policy. You saw their pictures before. They've done a wonderful job of bringing topics to light and into this conversation over the next 2 days that will be informative, challenging, profound, and sometimes awkward, but topics that we need to face. We're going to explore the lessons of 2020 and the opportunities that have been born of this moment. And I'm truly excited. I'm truly excited to participate with all of you. I hope you all go into it with a wonderfully open mind and a want and a need to make good public policy decisions over the next weeks, months, and years. Now, it's my pleasure to turn the microphone and the video over to my predecessor as CEO of AAAS. Alan Leshner probably needs no introduction to this group, and so I'm going to give him a very short one, which is to say that, as I understand it, he's happily unemployed and yet overbooked. Alan, if I could turn it over to you.
Great. Well, greetings, everybody, and good afternoon. I'm really delighted to be with all of you. There, I exist. Good. This is going to be one of the best, actually, S&T policy forums that AAAS has ever hosted, and I'm really happy to be a part of it. From my perspective, we're living in the midst of perhaps the most tumultuous period in the history of the relationship between science, policy, and the rest of society. And this year's S&T Policy Forum really reflects that complexity. The speakers are tremendous. They cover a wide array of perhaps the most critical topics facing our nation at this point, and I want to give my congratulations to the organizers. And I want to particularly thank them for giving me the pleasure and the honor of introducing this year's AAAS S&T Policy Forum keynote speaker, Dr. Marcia McNutt, the 22nd President of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. I consider Dr. McNutt to be one of the most effective and insightful leaders in the scientific community today. In fact, I consider her to be among the most effective and insightful leaders I've known in the, I'm embarrassed to say, 40 years I've been in Washington working at the intersection of science and public policy. Before she moved to the National Academies in 2016, she had been the editor-in-chief of the journal Science and the Science family of journals. Since we got to work together for the first few years that she was at Science, I can tell you that in addition to bringing great intellectual quality and leadership to Science, she brought great creativity and innovation to the enterprise. That included starting a couple of new journals, including Science Advances, AAAS's first open access journal. Before she came to Science, she served as the director of the U.S. Geological Survey, where she managed the U.S. response to a wide range of crises, including the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And before USGS, she was director of the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute and a professor at MIT. Dr. McNutt trained in geophysics with a bachelor's degree from Colorado College and a PhD from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. She's gotten a long list of awards and other recognition, including being a foreign member of the Royal Society in the UK and the Russian and Chinese Academy of Sciences. She's been granted 11 honorary Doctor of Science degrees, and she's a member and fellow of virtually every noteworthy scientific society, including the AAAS. With that, I give you my friend and colleague, Dr. Marcia McNutt. After her talk, we'll have time for questions, which I'll moderate. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone on the East Coast, and good morning for those of you on the West Coast. I'm Marcia McNutt, and it's my pleasure to be presenting this keynote for you today. What I decided to talk about was, with the retrospection of more than 6 months into this pandemic, what we might learn from this crisis about some of the more enduring problems we've been facing within both the scientific community and the nation, and how we might use them to emerge stronger and better. And the point of my talk here is that COVID has basically served as an amplifier to some long-standing issues that we were facing. And I list here some of the challenges that, as president of the National Academy of Sciences, I was dealing with prior to the COVID pandemic. Challenges in international relations, challenges at our nation's universities, particularly the research universities, challenges in dealing with misinformation on the internet. Of course, the challenge of climate change, with election security, and of course, with inequality in America. So for each of these topics, I'm going to describe what the issues seemed to be before COVID, and then how COVID acted as an amplifier. And then I'll finally end by talking about how we could see our way clear to use COVID as an impetus to improve our performance in each of these areas. So let's start with international. Here are just some of the headlines that we were experiencing prior to COVID. Many of you will remember the situation where the MD Anderson Cancer Research Institute had to oust 3 of its scientists over concerns about Chinese conflict of interest, where they were sharing pre-decisional research proposals with colleagues in China against the policy of the NIH, or how Chinese Thousand Talents programs were under US scrutiny because of the fact that they were a pipeline for intellectual property theft. And of course, lots of eyes on the Confucius Institutes at our nation's universities, that they might be vehicles for promoting Chinese propaganda. Because of all this scrutiny about the fact that our nation's research institutes and universities might be vehicles for improperly sharing our intellectual property, the National Academy had actually established a roundtable that would bring together researchers, people from the intelligence community, people from the funding institutions, and other areas to discuss how we might deal with these challenges. So that was all pre-COVID. Then came COVID, and all of the issues with China came to a head. Not only were we distrustful of China for the intellectual property issues, we just magnified the issues with China manyfold. We started blaming China for the virus itself. lots of discussion about how it might have even been rumors that it might have been purposeful. We heard just the other day that the US revoked the visas for 1,000 Chinese students who were deemed a security risk. And surveys showed that anti-China sentiment in the US was at a historic high. So what had started as a mostly academic problem was now escalating such that many people of Chinese descent in the US were actually fearing for their own safety. So next, let's talk about the situation at our nation's universities. Pre-COVID, there was a lot of hand-wringing at our nation's universities about the erosion in public support for the nation's universities, particularly if you look at the graph on the left here that showed the dwindling state support for higher education. It showed that since the year 2000, there had been a very dramatic decline in state support for our great public universities. And at the same time, as it shows on the right, that the state support was decreasing, tuition and fees were increasing. So that leads the public to question the value of a university education. It's costing more for the student, and was the education worth it? So the Academy was taking part in many roundtables to try to understand what we could do to show the value of a university education and to try to get more public support to keep university education affordable to students. Well, then the pandemic hit. And when the pandemic hit, the impact on universities was truly catastrophic. Many universities reported losses in the hundreds of millions of dollars. First of all, they lost international student income because students were no longer able to travel and pay tuition. Entire terms were canceled. There were extra costs for pivoting to online delivery of instructional materials. And while much of the instruction turned to online, the university still had the burden of maintaining their brick and mortar facilities. And many parents and students alike were questioning how universities could justify high tuition costs when the delivery of the instruction was online. So this now puts universities in quite a quandary. What are they going to do in the future? How do they justify maintaining these expensive facilities while many of them are going to be online even this coming fall? Some of them have tried to reopen for in-person classes, and some of them have found that they were not able to do so safely. So this is, and makes the problems pre-COVID seem almost trivial compared to what they're dealing with now. And then let's move to the topic of misinformation. We saw increasing degrees of misinformation on the web. This is caused by two things. First of all, the ease of distributing information on the web and the purposeful delivery of misinformation by bad actors who seek to foment division within the country and who also have secret special needs and their own reasons for wanting to sow misinformation. So the National Academy started this program called Based on Science, in which scientists work with science writers to deliver information that is scientifically validated to counter misinformation on the web, but the science writers ensure that it's written such that it is accessible by the general public. So pre-COVID, here are some of the issues we were dealing with. That fluoride in drinking waters is safe and beneficial, that sunscreen does not cause vitamin D deficiency, that cold weather can still happen even in a warming world, that vaccines don't cause autism, that most vitamins and supplements do not help with weight loss, and that, believe it or not, we have to say it, lemons cannot cure cancer. So these were the sorts of issues we were dealing with. And unfortunately, we had to write these articles because the information to counter the misinformation simply was not available on the web at a level that the average person was able to understand. But after COVID, the amount of misinformation just about COVID totally skyrocketed. So here's just a list of some of the topics we've posted about COVID. Like lemon juice doesn't cure COVID. And I'm not sure where this lemon juice lobby is coming from. Ginger does not prevent or cure COVID-19. What the effect of seasons are on the spread of COVID. That certainly just summer coming wasn't going to stop the spread of COVID. Whether you can catch COVID-19 from food, or how long the coronavirus lives on various surfaces. All these sorts of things are the subject of misinformation, rumors, and gossip on the web that we felt we had to put the correct science information at a level that the public could understand. Climate change. In pre-COVID, our concern was mainly with the lack of timely mitigation for climate change in order to avoid the worst impacts of pending global warming, and the fact that we weren't acting fast enough was going to require other kinds of intervention, such as the development of negative emissions technologies, such as carbon capture and sequestration, climate intervention, otherwise known as geoengineering, or rapid adaptation and massive human migrations. So that's what we were worried about before COVID. But with COVID, given that we've seen a major upswing in intense hurricanes, floods, and fires this year, but the problem with all these disasters is because of social distancing guidelines and massive unemployment, we've seen a problem with how society is reacting to these disasters. People do not want to go to shelters because they can't socially distance at the shelters, and they're worried about leaving their property unattended because of the high unemployment rate. They're worried will increase crime. So COVID, along with natural disasters, is a perfect storm. And inequality has also exacerbated the impacts of these natural disasters. It's layered natural disaster on top of a health disaster. And I've just shown a picture here from taken at noon the other day at my home in coastal California that shows the sun never even rose that day because of all the smoke in the air. And you're looking out over the hills, and you should be seeing the ocean out there, and you can't see a thing. Now the next topic, election security. Prior to COVID, our concern at the National Academy was with the nascent movement in many voting jurisdictions towards trying to implement electronic voting. Well, there had been some dramatic demonstrations that any voting over the internet was not secure. One of the more interesting ones came when a group from Michigan hacked the DC electronic voting and was able to change people's votes. And every time they changed a vote, the computer played the Michigan fight song. So it was really clear that electronic voting, anything over the internet, was not secure. And the report we put out urged that all votes have a paper record, even those using off-network machines, mechanical machines that are not connected to the network. They should create a paper record of the votes. Now, with COVID, the problem of election security has become even more difficult because many people don't want to vote in person. Many election workers do not want to man the polls, so there are fewer polling stations open, and the voters themselves don't want to wait in line to vote and chance getting COVID. So that has led many people to want to vote by mail. But Homeland Security has warned us that Russia is trying to undermine confidence in mail-in voting. And this is a huge problem because surveys have shown that there is a difference politically in those who are likely to vote by mail and those who are likely to vote in person. So that could determine the outcome of the election. And then, of course, you all remember the headlines about the mail being slowed down by the actions of the Postmaster General, such that it threatened whether mail-in ballots would even be delivered in time. So COVID has just increased the election problems in several dimensions. And then growing inequality. This is data from Raj Chetty at Harvard University. It shows on the left the fading American dream, how in 1960, a child born in 1960 had a better than 50% chance of having an income potential greater than his or her parents. Now, a child born in 1985 who is well into their career today has, it was a greater than 90% chance in 1960 that they would have, I'm sorry, I'm not reading this right. In 1940, a child born had a greater than 90% chance of exceeding his or her parents' income. And now it's a flip of the coin for a child born in 1985, whether he or she will exceed their parents' income. And if you look at the map of inequality, you can see that where you're born makes a difference. That a child born in the Southeast has 1/4 the opportunity of a child born in, say, the Midwest of exceeding their parents' income level. So inequality has increased over time, and it is unequal. It is worse in some parts of the US than other parts. And that's what we were mostly dealing with prior to COVID. Now with COVID, the disadvantaged are not just poor, but they're also dying. The disadvantaged are more likely to be essential workers on the front line. They're more likely to have pre-existing conditions that would mean if they got COVID, they're more likely to have a bad case of it. And they're less likely to be able to socially distance from other family members, and therefore more likely to spread it to others in their family. And the plot on the right just shows that, for example, in Louisiana, the 32% of the state's population is African American, but 70% of those who have died are African American. In Illinois, 15% of the state's population are African American, but 42% of those who have died are African American. Just shows the inequality that COVID has accentuated. So this brings me to the opportunity. I view every crisis as an opportunity. And the reason for that is that during a crisis, people are more willing to put aside their differences and work together towards a common goal. Barriers that seemed insurmountable before suddenly seem like they aren't such a big deal anymore. And I love this poster. It says, let's make a world where we tell our children how bad things were before COVID-19. And it's because we've overcome so many of these problems that were accentuated by COVID, and we actually make them become insignificant. So let's quickly go through these. What could we do with international? Well, we've noticed at the National Academy that we are incorporating international voices in our work much more than we ever did before. Because before, we thought we had to fly people in from other countries in order to include international people. Now that everyone is just getting together on Zoom and through the internet, we find there's no barrier other than time zones to getting people from other countries involved in our work. So that means with foreign travel on hold due to the virus, we can easily build virtual networks abroad. We can use immersive experiences to absorb foreign places and cultures, and we can employ real-time translators to eliminate language barriers. The US has been for too many years a country that has been insulated from foreigners. Our students don't go abroad enough, and we rarely travel compared to many other people from other nations. We should make that a thing of the past and start using the internet to become far more cosmopolitan. We can reimagine higher education. If we are freed from the traditional model of classroom lectures, we could pace teaching to each student's rate of learning. Teachers can pre-record their lectures, and the students can go through them as fast or as slow as they want. They could free the calendar to a student's schedule, even students that need to work. We can eliminate geographic barriers for students who can't move or can't travel, and we could engage a much more diverse student body in higher education. And to counter misinformation, we can build trust in science. COVID is a crisis for which science can truly make a life and death difference. So we have to start by delivering on a vaccine. And then better signal what is trusted in science. This chart on the left, I borrowed from Kathleen Hall Jameson, and it shows the sort of sequence by which science earns trust in what it knows. And we should use clear signals for how much we trust something. If we've only noticed something once, a single instance, we don't trust it very much. But if it's a clear observational study or a statistically significant study, if it's been peer reviewed, if it's double blind, if it's placebo controlled, if it's a systematic review, if there's convergent data, all of these are words that show growing trust in a result. And then finally, build trusted brands and build trusted spokespeople for delivering information to the public. And for climate change, we can use what we have learned during this pandemic to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. COVID has accelerated telework options and virtual meetings. We could eliminate much of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with daily commutes. We could reduce the building footprint as homes replace offices. People don't have to have double places, both an office and a home. They could have one or the other. And we could slash airline travel as meetings go virtual. We can see from this plot on the left, the greenhouse gases are already set to decline in 2020, and a very rare occurrence for the US because of, and this is globally, because of people being on lockdown. And then in terms of voting, we should make voting easy. With both election officials and voters wary of showing up at polling stations, we should make registering to vote easy, but absolutely verified. We should do it, for example, as soon as, whenever you get a driver's license, whenever you get a passport, make sure you get registered. And mail-in ballots should be available through an easy online form. And then finally, we can tackle the many dimensions of inequality by reducing cost barriers to international experiences, by making education accessible, by enfranchising all citizens, and by eliminating birth location as a predictor of future potential. So in closing, the pandemic has taken a huge toll. We owe it to ourselves and to future generations to ensure that we use this trial to emerge much better than we were before. So thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. That was a terrific talk. I particularly appreciated not only that you articulated the problems and the changes caused by COVID, but actually came up with things that could be done to mitigate the effects. So my question to you, and let me remind people that if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. My question is, these are great ideas about what needs to be done. Is there a role, and then how do we make it happen if there is one, for individual scientists to effect some of these kinds of responses that you're suggesting? Or would we be best off to leave that to organized science, to the academies, to AAAS, to the institutions? Does that make some sense?
Sure, Ellen. Did you want me to take that question, or?
No, that's for you.
Okay, great. Hold on. Let me get this ringing phone to shut up. Hold on. Sorry about that. I think it's going to shut up. Okay. Yeah, so I think that it's going to take more than just scientists to solve these problems. But I think it's going to take scientists working in conjunction with civil society to make a difference. And I think that's why we really have to work hard in venues such as this to reach policymakers and to reach the public. It can't be done by scientists alone, but I think that science is an important stakeholder at the table, and that we have to identify some of these issues, and we also have to help with science to inform the solutions.
So I'm going to turn to the list of questions which are rolling in front of me at a tremendous rate. It's a sign of the stimulating nature of your talk. This is not unrelated. Are we seeing an irreversible transformation of society, work, and social interactions as a result of COVID? And if we are seeing a transformation, how do we get the best from this? How are we going to do best at what you have called on numerous occasions, building back better?
So I think it's a bit TBD, Alan, in that regard. But most people I talk to who are in leadership positions, heads of major corporations, heads of major organizations, are all telling me that they will never go back, that they will not return to the way things were pre-COVID, that their employees don't want that. And speaking for the National Academy, our staff doesn't want that. Our volunteers don't want that. And even our stakeholders don't want that. So the question is, how do we preserve the best of what we've learned from COVID, of the nimbleness, the inclusiveness, the low CO2 footprint of how we've been able to operate during COVID, but still understand that there has been something lost as well. And we don't want to permanently lose the opportunity to engage on a personal level. In particular, I'm concerned about the younger generation, the students, the postdocs, the new recruits into any field who really need that mentorship. They need to be somehow indoctrinated into the culture of an organization in a more personal way. They need to rub elbows with leadership and get to know people on a first name basis. That is hard to do over a Zoom call. And so we'll have to find ways to make sure that happens as well.
So another question from the group. Are we seeing, wait, I asked that. I'm sorry, I apologize. COVID is here to stay with us for at least the next 2 years. Will we be able to work out a global strategy to bring life back as close as possible? And how will we help the most vulnerable among us in this process?
Yeah. So that is a great question, because I think the focus really does need to be on the most vulnerable. We have seen COVID as such an amplifier of inequality. We saw even before COVID how the disparity between the haves and the have-nots had been growing. And now it has only gotten worse. And I worry that with all of the money that is being devoted to bailouts and things like that, that the tendency to want to, for the government to want to be penny pinching in order to rein in future deficits will make it very difficult to create a more equal society. The only way I see out of that is through education. And if we can rapidly get into place accessible education for all, and something like one of the important things we can do is lower the technology barrier. If we can make sure that everyone in this country has access to high-speed communications infrastructure and low-cost technology to get on that information superhighway, so that everyone has access to a high-quality education, and there is no technology barrier and no information barrier to getting on that. That is what I see as our one shining hope for getting through this.
Thank you. That's a great answer. So I particularly like this next question. In the pandemic, we've seen science and the scientific method taking a much more prominent place in the public's view and in a new way. This person has written, the lay public usually sees just the end result, the relatively reliable answer, after we've gone through our uncertainties. But now they're seeing the messy process involved in getting there, where things are one way and then they back off a bit, then they go a little bit in a different way. how do we educate people, including adults, so that they can understand that process and that understanding? How do we get that done?
Well, Alan, I just love this question because it plays so perfectly to one of my hobby horses that I love to ride every chance I get. And that is that we, unfortunately, for far too long, have taught science as a body of facts or a body of information, Newton's law, Maxwell's equations, whatever. And instead, those of us who are scientists know that science is really the best ever devised method for divining the laws that govern the natural world. And those laws are always subject to refinement and improvement as better experiments are done and more creative ways for understanding those laws come about. And if everyone understood that science is an approach and it's not an answer, then I think people would understand better that they are seeing the unfolding of the scientific method before their very eyes with this pandemic.
So since I've failed miserably for 40 years at getting the public to understand the particular nature of the enterprise and where it goes, do you have any particular suggestions of how a community like ours can make progress on that front?
Well, I do think that the next gen science standards are very much tuned to that direction because they teach inquiry-based science, that students learn science by doing. So the idea is that science is not a title that is bestowed, a scientist is not a title bestowed on someone because they have mastered a list of facts, but because they have mastered a methodology. And I think that's important because when someone says to me, oh, I would like to become a scientist, I say to them, well, you can be a scientist. Can you come up with an interesting idea or a hypothesis, something you'd like to test? And can you come up with an idea for how you would test whether that is true? And then are you willing to expose your result for others' critical review? And if you're willing to do that, then you can be a scientist.
I like it. So recently, I'm shifting gears again. We only have time for maybe 2 more quick questions. One of them being studies have shown recently that women and women scientists have been burdened particularly heavily during the COVID with excess caregiving. Is there anything we can do other than exhortation to help women sort of get through this period where they already have an unfair burden of caregiving from my point of view? Now COVID has made it even worse. What can we do to help? Is there something?
Okay, well, first of all, Alan, the studies have shown that women across the board, not just in science, have been horrible victims of COVID, that they have dropped out of the workforce at exceedingly large numbers because of this burden of caregiving. And science is just another example of that. One approach we took at the National Academy was we went out to all of our staff and we asked for donations of leave for all of those staff members who didn't have extra burdens of care to give to those who did, so that we could allow those who had the extra burdens of care to have the time off to homeschool young children or to take care of elderly parents or whatever, so that they could have the time to do that and still put whatever time they could afford into their jobs and still take home their salaries. So that's one thing we did. But I think that employers really have to make some accommodations for their female staff members, understanding this extra burden that they bear. Otherwise, we are going to lose a huge fraction of the female workforce, and it's not just in science. This is a very important problem. The Academy is doing a study on women scientists and COVID right now, and I'm looking forward to that study being published, because I think it will have very specific recommendations for women scientists. So stay tuned.
Thank you, Marcia. We'll look forward to the answer that comes out of that, and figuring out how to get it implemented in a broad way. Let me first apologize to the people whose questions we weren't able to get to. There's an array of really outstanding questions. I wish there were a way to just share the questions with the whole audience. And then thank you, Dr. McNutt, for a tremendous, stimulating, provocative, insightful, and you gave us an agenda of things to think about doing. So I thank you very much for that.